April. Okay, the BP Deepwater Horizon rig disaster occurred on April 20th of this year. 11 rig workers died in this tragedy. And as a result, our friends on the left are taking our noses and trying to twist them. There's this article in the Wall Street Journal. No, I mean the Wall Street Journal. That was supposed to be a joke. Not very funny, but it's sort of like, you know, when a bear plays the violin and rides on a unicycle, you don't ask, is the bear on tune? You say, wow, a bear on a unicycle playing the violin, whoa. So when an economist tells a joke, you don't say, well, was it funny or not? You say, whoa, an economist told a joke, whoa. So anyway, here we have, what's his name? Thomas Frank, writing in the Wall Street Journal. The title of his article on June 2nd was Laissez-faire meets the oil spill. It's an attempt to embarrass people who favor laissez-faire and say, see what you have when you have laissez-faire? I mean, as if the Gulf of Mexico is the prime example of laissez-faire, and there's been no regulation. It's been a pure It's very similar to, you know, blaming the economic crisis, the meltdown that Tom Woods talks about in his book, or the 1932-31 depression on laissez-faire. It's as if we had laissez-faire in 28, or we had laissez-faire in 2006. It's a constant refrain. Whenever a problem occurs, the lefties will say, well, that's laissez-faire for you. Even though, you know, we've got the Fed, we've got all sorts of regulatory bureaus, somehow it's laissez-faire's fault. Here's what he says. He says, quoting Thomas Frank, only a short while ago, of course, the populist right was riding high, sweeping the primaries and insisting that the operations of the market must not be interfered with, that government intervention of even the slightest kind dangerously diminishes human freedom. And where are we now, he goes on. Here's another quote from him. Back in April, for example, Rep. Ron Paul, Republican Texas, greeted the president's drilling policy with the suggestion that the Environmental Protection Agency be abolished and the energy market freed from bureaucrats so that it might answer to the demands of the people and the decisions of private investors. But what about the Tea Partiers today? Who will step forward now and demand that the energy market be rescued from regulatory bondage? Well, I guess here I am. I'm going to try to do that. I'm going to try to rescue the energy market from regulatory bondage, because there's been plenty of regulatory bondage. And the way I'll introduce this topic is I'll look at the before, the after, and then what is the solution. Okay, so what was happening before this tragedy occurred? What was happening before was that they weren't allowing drilling to occur in the Alaska Arctic National Wildlife Reserve, which is a vast area of Alaska where there's plenty of oil, and you don't get oil spills on the land, so it'd be safer to drill there. The oil sands in Alberta, a different way of getting oil from the sands. You sort of mine it like coal, and everyone is saying, oh, no, we have to boycott Canada because, you know, this is environmentally incorrect. Then there's the National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska. This is a reserve set aside for petroleum drilling. And somebody once said, well, if you can't drill in the petroleum reserve, where can you drill? And then the other one is the shallow offshore of the Gulf of Mexico. Look, it's a lot easier to drill in 25 feet of water than in 1 mile of water, about 6,000 feet. And if there's a problem in 25 feet deep of water, it's a lot easier to solve than when the problem is a mile down. But the environmentalists were instrumental in making sure that you couldn't drill close to the shore, and you had to drill way out in the deep water, and well, so they all contributed to the problem, indirectly. Then there's one of my favorite regulatory bureaus, the Minerals Management Service, MMS. They were in the news before this problem, and anyone know what they were in the news for?
For partying and doing coke with the people they were regulating?
I heard pornography, but I'll accept They go together, you know, rock and roll and pornography and coke and stuff like that. That's what they were doing. They're supposed to be regulating these people, but they were in the news for porn and prostitution. And not that I'm against those things. I think they should be legal. But, you know, if you're going to have a regulatory bureau doing that stuff on company time instead of regulating, and then you're going to complain that it's laissez-faire capitalism at work, well, you know, that's a hard reach. They had this thing, a 582-page pamphlet or book called Regional Oil Spill Response Plan, Gulf of Mexico, that they imposed on BP and every other driller, and it doesn't even mention deep water oil spills. So here you have a regulatory bureau that has this 600-page thing. It doesn't anticipate this problem. These are the regulators. It reminds me of what happened with Katrina. FEMA and the Army Corps of Engineers, between them, killed 1,500 people because of the dikes. It wasn't Katrina's fault. I mean, Katrina really missed us. It was the dikes sort of fell apart. And are FEMA and the Army Corps of Engineers still in business? You're darn tootin' they are, because they're government regulatory bureaus. If they were private regulatory bureaus, that would be it for them. But they're governmental ones. Well, the MMS... I cannot tell a lie. The MMS is no longer. They've changed their name. See, regulation works. The MMS is gone. I was going to say capitalism works. No, regulation works. They're now called the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, Regulation and Enforcement, or for short, the Bureau of Ocean Energy, BOE. It's sort of like an Ayn Rand novel where she keeps coming up with these bureaus to regulate the railroads or bureaus to regulate steel. I mean, that book was written in 1957, and it's really got this Deepwater Horizon rig disaster in its eyesight. Very much like public housing. Instead of learning about commerce and learning about income cutoffs, they think it's high-rises. No, changing it to the BOE isn't going to help anything. The number of inspectors was 60 to examine 4,000 facilities, which you think is a little too few if you're going to have good regulation. But in the last 20 years, the number of inspectors stayed the same at 60, and yet the deep water wells rose 900%. Now, I'm not sure if I'm happy with this or unhappy with this. I noticed that in agriculture, it used to be that there were more farmers than members of the Department of Agriculture. And that sort of swapped. Now there are more regulators than farmers, almost. So I'm not sure if I favor demanding a monopoly over regulation and keeping too few people in there or not. It's something we should think about. But the point is that what they're saying is this was an era of laissez-faire, but it wasn't an era of laissez-faire. This was a heavily regulated, or at least unheavily regulated thing by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the Environmental Protection Agency, the MMS, the BOE, and left-wing environmental groups who are always out there trying to improve the world. Okay, that's the before picture. What's the after picture? The after picture, first on the list, is a thing called the Jones Act, as in Smith, Jones. What the Jones Act is a law that's been around for 100 years, which says that any commerce around our shores has to be in U.S.-owned boats with U.S. organized labor workers on those boats. And for some reason or another, the world's leading experts in cleaning up oily water are the Dutch. They're used to oil spills because they're dikes and stuff, and they've got technology that puts us into the shade. And I think now, finally, after a long, long while, your president and mine has allowed some help from the Dutch, who offered it very early. Again, very similar to the situation with Katrina, where all sorts of people came to help. They came with big boats full of staterooms for the homeless. They came with water and ice and orange juice and stuff, and they were turned back by FEMA. Well, the same thing has been occurring with the Obama administration in turning back help for the water. There's another rule, this rule called the 15 parts per million rule. This is the idea that it's illegal to dump into the Gulf of Mexico or any of the Mississippi River or anything like that, any water that has more than 15 parts per million impurities. Well, the Dutch ships can take water with, a 500,000 impurities per million and regurgitate it and spew it out with 100 parts per million, which is very, very clean. But they're not allowed to because of this rule. So what our very inefficient boats do is they scoop up the water, they go hundreds of miles away to dump it on land, and then they come back and it's a very, very slow process. So it's as if they're purposely trying to make things worse by applying this and not saying, well, this 1,500 million rule, 15 part per million rule was okay in ordinary circumstances, but now we have an emergency, we have to temporarily disband it, or temporarily disband the Jones Act. No, these people have their principles. We're going to stick with this even if it screws up the environment. Then they have this thing, a moratorium on all drilling, which happily they've stopped, but as Bob Higgs makes clear, industrial accidents occur. If you want to build a high-rise, or you want to build a bridge or a road or a big farm or a mine, sometimes people get killed. You do the best you can, and under laissez-faire there would be a minimum of this because the incentives would be right and the information would be right. But just because some people die, you can't stop all of drilling. I mean, if you have a plane crash, does that mean we can't have planes anymore? If you have a car crash, no more cars? It's sort of very radical, but not very acceptable. Okay, what's the solution? The solution, as I see it, is privatize the Gulf of Mexico. Right now, the Gulf of Mexico is either owned by the government, the U.S. government, with a little help from the Mexican government, or it's unowned. And when it's unowned, you have the tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of the commons is that you tend to overuse things. That's why the cow never came within 1 million miles of extinction, because it was privately owned. If you shot a cow today, you didn't have that cow tomorrow, so the cost of shooting the cow today was very high. Whereas the buffalo was unowned. If you shot a buffalo today, you didn't have it tomorrow anyway, so the cost of shooting it today were zero, so you might as well shoot it. So the buffalo were going extinct, the cow never came within 1 million miles of extinction. Well, you have a similar sort of a problem with the Gulf of Mexico. If the Gulf of Mexico is owned by the Gulf of Mexico Corporation, the Gulf of Mexico Corporation presumably would take more care with just this sort of a thing than an unowned situation. I mean, Obama, I don't even think, heard of or considered anything about the Gulf of Mexico before this problem occurred. Whereas if the Gulf of Mexico Corporation owned the Gulf of Mexico, it would eat, live, breathe, and sleep Gulf of Mexico situations, and it would presumably take better care of what it owned, and if it didn't, it would lose money and it would be bought out by somebody else. Not just having a name change as in the BOE for the MMS. Well, how would we do this? Well, ideally, according to Locke and Hoppe and Rothbard, what you do is you homestead the land or the water. The people who mix their labor with it get to be the owners of it. Now, this might be a little difficult to figure out who was using the Gulf of Mexico. Or when I was doing work with Lou Rockwell, he and I have 2 articles coming out on the Katrina situation. We were talking about privatizing the Mississippi River and putting the Mississippi River under the ownership of the Mississippi River Corporation. Well, it's a little hard to figure out who were the rightful owners of the Mississippi River. From a God's eye point of view, knowing full knowledge, we could tell exactly who used the Mississippi River, and those guys would own it in proportion to how much they used it. A substitute thing might be to take every person who lives within 5 miles of the Mississippi River and all those cities up and down the river, and anyone who has a boat or worked on there, and let's say there are 25 million people that I've just described. Well, you make a new corporation with 25 million shares, and you give it to them, and now they're the owners, and you can buy and sell shares in the Mississippi River. There's this joke, I'll sell you the Brooklyn Bridge. Well, for libertarians, buying a bridge is a reasonable thing, because if it's in the government's hands, it's going to be a mess up, and if it's in private hands, you'll have the ordinary structures of supply and demand and prices and profits. So one way to privatize the Gulf of Mexico is to take everyone all around Texas, Louisiana, Florida, Mexican cities, people who own boats and transport stuff around there, the people who've been digging mines and drilling for oil in the Gulf, and take those 25 million people, I'm just guessing at the numbers, and say, okay, you guys now own the Gulf of Mexico, and good luck to you. I think that would be the libertarian situation. I'm out of time. I hope you enjoyed this.